Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. If you have not subscribed yet, subscribe and like this channel so we can continue uncovering powerful stories hidden in the shadows of history. Stay with us until the very end, because this story is one of silent endurance, calculated retaliation, and a woman who reached the edge of survival. Relax, remove distractions, and listen closely as we begin. In the year 1857, in a quiet county in Virginia where tobacco fields stretched wide beneath humid skies, an enslaved woman named Nelly walked carefully across the wooden floor of a plantation kitchen. The house above her was large, white, and imposing. The kitchen, however, was a place of heat and smoke. It was where meals were prepared and where authority was enforced without witnesses. Virginia in the 1850s was not a new slave state. It was one of the oldest. Slavery there had matured into routine. The system operated smoothly on the surface. Fields were planted. Harvests were sold. Enslaved people labored from dawn until darkness. But beneath that routine lived something more fragile than slaveholders wished to admit. Resentment. Memory. Calculation. Nelly worked inside the house. That position carried danger. Enslaved women in domestic roles were watched closely, yet they were also exposed to forms of abuse that rarely reached official record. They served food. They cleaned rooms. They entered private spaces. They listened to conversations not meant for them. And often, they endured violence in silence. Court records from Virginia during this period show multiple cases of enslaved women accused of poisoning. The pattern was striking. Many of these women worked in kitchens. Many were described as previously obedient. Many were accused after an enslaver fell violently ill following a meal. Poison was a quiet weapon. It did not require strength. It required access and patience. On one summer evening in 1857, the plantation master returned home from the fields in a foul mood. Witnesses later described raised voices earlier that week. Some enslaved people recalled hearing arguments inside the house. No official document recorded what was said. The legal system did not prioritize the words of enslaved witnesses. Supper was prepared as usual. Meat, bread, and vegetables were placed carefully on the table. Nelly moved in and out of the dining room with controlled expression. She had done this hundreds of times before. She understood routine. She understood timing. Within hours of finishing the meal, the enslaver began complaining of sharp stomach pain. He doubled over in his chair. Sweat beaded across his forehead. Vomiting followed. The household panicked. Doctors were summoned. Word spread quickly across the plantation that something was terribly wrong. By morning, suspicion turned to poison. Arsenic was common in plantation households. It was used to control pests and protect stored grain. In small quantities it could be concealed. In larger amounts it was deadly. The symptoms were familiar enough that physicians suspected it almost immediately. Attention shifted to the kitchen. Who had handled the meal? Who had access to storage? Who had reason? In slaveholding logic, reason did not require proof. It required vulnerability. Nelly was questioned. Interrogations of enslaved people during this era were not gentle conversations. They often involved threats, confinement, and physical coercion. The court transcript later recorded that she confessed. It stated that she placed poison into the food intentionally. The document did not detail how long she was questioned. It did not describe the tone of that interrogation. What it did record, briefly, was motive. The clerk wrote that Nelly had endured prolonged abuse and could endure no more. Those words are powerful in their simplicity. Prolonged abuse. The record did not specify whether the abuse was physical, sexual, or psychological. In many documented cases involving enslaved women, all three were intertwined. The law did not consider abuse justification for retaliation. It considered retaliation destruction of property. The trial moved quickly. Enslaved defendants were not granted the same legal protections as white citizens. They were tried before juries composed entirely of white men, many of whom owned slaves themselves. The court did not dwell on the conditions of Nelly's life. It focused on the act. Poisoning. Intentional. Fatal. She was found guilty. The sentence was death. Public executions of enslaved people in Virginia were designed as spectacle. They were meant to reinforce order and discourage rebellion. Crowds gathered. Enslaved people were often forced to attend as warning. The message was clear. Authority would be preserved. Yet beneath the spectacle lay a deeper truth. Poisoning cases frightened slaveholders for a specific reason. They revealed vulnerability within the most intimate spaces. Fields could be patrolled. Whips could enforce labor. But kitchens, dining rooms, and bedrooms required trust. And trust within a system of brutality was fragile. Nelly's act was not a public uprising. It was not a march down a river road. It was personal. Calculated. Quiet. It required waiting. It required knowledge of timing. It required acceptance of consequence. In the ledger of a Virginia courthouse, her name appears only briefly. Nelly. Charged with poisoning. Intentional. Executed. But behind that ink stands a woman who endured suffering long enough to decide that silence was no longer survival. Oppression often imagines itself secure. Yet history shows that even within systems built on violence, resistance finds form. Sometimes it is loud. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it marches with weapons. Sometimes it waits beside a dinner plate. In 1857, in a plantation kitchen in Virginia, a woman who had endured prolonged abuse chose retaliation. And the record, though written by those who condemned her, confirms one thing clearly. It was intentional. This is where her shadow begins. After the verdict was delivered in the summer of 1857, Nelly was no longer simply an enslaved woman working in a Virginia kitchen. She became a warning. Her name began to circulate quietly among neighboring plantations, not as a symbol of justice, but as an example of what happened when an enslaved person dared to strike back. Yet beneath that official narrative of order and punishment lived another story, one carried in whispers among enslaved communities who understood far more than the court ever recorded. The courthouse that condemned her stood as a pillar of authority. White columns. Wooden benches. A judge elevated above the room. The structure itself was meant to project stability. But stability built on fear is never entirely secure. The poisoning case unsettled local slaveholders more deeply than they admitted publicly. It revealed a vulnerability that could not be easily patrolled. The fields were visible. The overseer's whip was visible. But a kitchen, a cup, a plate of food, these were ordinary objects transformed into instruments of resistance. News of the case spread slowly through Virginia's rural counties. Plantation owners discussed it during gatherings and church meetings. They reminded one another to be cautious. Some insisted that enslaved people should no longer handle certain substances without supervision. Others tightened restrictions around kitchens and storage rooms. Arsenic, once kept casually to control pests, was now treated with heightened suspicion. It was a small shift, but it revealed anxiety. Among enslaved people, however, the story carried a different tone. Nelly's act was not celebrated openly. Celebration would have been dangerous. But understanding moved quietly from cabin to cabin. Many had endured prolonged abuse of their own. They understood what that phrase in the court ledger truly meant. It meant years of humiliation. It meant violation. It meant powerlessness. And it meant reaching a point where survival itself demanded action. Women in domestic roles felt the tension sharply. They prepared meals under watchful eyes. They moved carefully, aware that any accusation could bring deadly consequence. The kitchen became a space of dual reality. On the surface, it was a place of service. Beneath that surface, it was a place where knowledge and proximity created possibility. Slaveholders could not entirely escape dependence on those they enslaved. That dependence created fear. The execution day approached under heavy skies. Public executions in Virginia during the 1850s were staged to reinforce hierarchy. Enslaved people from surrounding plantations were often compelled to attend. The goal was intimidation. The message was direct. Retaliation would end in death. Nelly was brought forward in chains. The court record does not describe her expression. It does not note whether she spoke. It simply records the fulfillment of sentence. But those who witnessed such events often remembered them for years. The image of a woman condemned for poisoning her enslaver would have remained etched in memory. Slaveholders believed that spectacle would extinguish defiance. Yet history shows that spectacle sometimes deepens it. The display of punishment does not erase the cause of resistance. It exposes it. Every enslaved person present would have known that prolonged abuse had been recorded as motive. That detail mattered. It acknowledged, even if briefly, that suffering preceded retaliation. After her execution, life on the plantation resumed its rhythm. Tobacco still had to be planted. Harvests still had to be sold. The enslaver's death did not dismantle the system. Another white man assumed control of the estate. But the atmosphere had changed. Trust had thinned. Conversations about obedience carried sharper edges. The poisoning case also entered county archives, preserved in ink. Decades later, historians examining trial transcripts would notice patterns. Enslaved women accused of poisoning often described mistreatment. The courts rarely investigated those claims. Instead, they focused on protecting property and authority. Yet the repetition of such cases revealed something deeper. Domestic spaces were not immune to rebellion. Poisoning as resistance carried unique characteristics. It was not collective like a field uprising. It did not require hundreds marching together. It required secrecy. It required patience. It required a willingness to accept certain death if discovered. In that sense, it was intensely personal. It emerged not from political ideology, but from survival and dignity. In Virginia during the 1850s, enslaved women faced overlapping threats. They labored in fields or houses. They endured the constant risk of sale. They lived under laws that denied them bodily autonomy. Sexual exploitation was widespread, though rarely acknowledged in courtrooms. For some, poison became the only accessible weapon within reach. Nelly's case stands within that broader pattern. It was not isolated. It was part of a quiet form of resistance woven into the fabric of domestic slavery. Her name may appear only briefly in official documents, but her act reveals a deeper truth about the system. Slavery required constant enforcement because it generated constant resentment. As the nation moved closer to civil war in the late 1850s, tensions over slavery intensified. Legal battles like Dred Scott in 1857 reinforced the idea that African Americans had no rights recognized by federal law. In that environment, individual acts of retaliation carried symbolic weight. They reminded both sides that slavery was not accepted passively by those who endured it. The Virginia courthouse likely believed it had closed the case with Nelly's execution. But history does not close so easily. Each recorded act of resistance adds to a larger narrative. It demonstrates that beneath obedience lay awareness. Beneath silence lay memory. Beneath submission lay the possibility of defiance. Even without speeches or letters in her own hand, Nelly's story speaks. It speaks through the phrase prolonged abuse. It speaks through the deliberate act recorded in court. It speaks through the fear her case generated among slaveholders. And it reminds us that resistance does not always arrive with drums and marching feet. Sometimes it moves quietly through a kitchen at dusk. Sometimes it waits in stillness. And sometimes, in a world that denies every other option, it chooses retaliation. In the months after Nelly's execution in the year 1857, the plantation did not fall silent. It grew quieter in a different way. Voices lowered when speaking near the big house. Movements became measured. Enslaved women in the kitchen kept their eyes down longer than before. Yet beneath that outward caution, something deeper shifted. The memory of what had happened could not be erased. It settled into the daily rhythm of labor like a hidden pulse. Slaveholders told themselves that the execution had restored order. They pointed to the rope and the public display as proof that authority had prevailed. But authority that must constantly prove itself is not secure. It is anxious. Poisoning frightened slaveholders more than open rebellion for a simple reason. Open rebellion could be met with guns and militias. Poison could move invisibly. It required proximity and trust. It required the enslaver to eat what someone else prepared. That quiet dependency unsettled the illusion of absolute control. Records from Virginia in the late 1850s show that plantation management began shifting in small but telling ways. Access to storage rooms containing chemicals was restricted. Some slaveholders insisted that white family members oversee meal preparation more closely. Others replaced domestic workers after rumors of resentment surfaced. These changes were not publicly framed as fear. They were described as prudence. Yet prudence grows from vulnerability. Within enslaved communities, Nelly's story traveled carefully. It was not told loudly. It did not need to be. Those who endured abuse recognized the meaning without explanation. Women who worked inside plantation homes understood the danger and the possibility that came with proximity. They knew that domestic space was both a cage and a position of knowledge. In kitchens, one overheard conversations about debts, sales, punishments. Information moved quietly between cabins after dark. The phrase recorded in court, prolonged abuse, became a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. It suggested that the breaking point had not been sudden. It had been built over time. That pattern was familiar. Slavery was not a single violent act. It was a system of repeated violations. Each insult, each beating, each unwanted touch accumulated. Retaliation, when it came, emerged from layers of endurance. As the nation edged closer to civil war, tensions intensified. The Dred Scott decision had declared that African Americans could not claim citizenship. Political debates grew louder. Yet on plantations, daily life remained rooted in control and resistance. Enslaved men and women navigated survival carefully. Some planned escape. Some endured silently. Some chose confrontation in small, calculated ways. Nelly's act did not inspire a mass uprising. It did not bring armies to the gates. But it revealed something essential. Even within intimate spaces, the enslaved were thinking, weighing options, observing weaknesses. Slavery depended on the belief that those it bound were passive. Each poisoning case contradicted that belief. It proved that submission was often strategic, not sincere. The plantation where Nelly had lived eventually absorbed her absence into routine. Another enslaved woman likely filled her place in the kitchen. Meals were prepared. Tobacco was harvested. Accounts were balanced. But the memory lingered. Enslavers who sat down to eat might have wondered, even briefly, about the hands that prepared their food. Suspicion is corrosive. It eats at certainty. By the early 1860s, war erupted across the United States. Virginia became a battleground. Armies marched through fields that had once been quiet. The structure of slavery began to fracture under military pressure. Enslaved people seized opportunities to escape when Union troops advanced. The system that had condemned Nelly as property began to collapse. When emancipation arrived in 1865, it did not resurrect those executed for resistance. It did not return lives lost to retaliation. But it transformed the legal landscape that had justified their punishment. The courts that once tried enslaved people as property were forced to confront a new reality. Slavery was no longer law. In the years after emancipation, formerly enslaved communities rebuilt lives under difficult conditions. Violence and segregation followed, yet freedom altered possibility. Stories of resistance from the slavery era took on new meaning. They were remembered not only as warnings, but as evidence of strength. Nelly's act, though recorded by hostile hands, became part of that broader legacy. Historians examining Virginia court archives decades later noticed recurring patterns in poisoning cases. Enslaved women often cited mistreatment. Courts rarely investigated those claims. The structure of justice prioritized white authority. Yet even within that structure, fragments of truth survived in brief notes and marginal comments. Through those fragments, lives like Nelly's become visible again. Her story forces reflection on how resistance adapts to circumstance. Not everyone could lead a revolt of hundreds. Not everyone could flee across state lines. Domestic workers occupied a different position within the hierarchy of slavery. Their resistance, when it emerged, reflected that proximity. It was quiet, strategic, and deeply personal. Slavery sought to reduce human beings to obedience. Yet obedience enforced by fear is fragile. Beneath it lies memory. Beneath it lies calculation. Nelly's act demonstrates that even in the most controlled environments, agency could surface. It carried terrible consequence, yet it existed. Standing today in the archives where her name is written, one sees only ink on paper. A brief description. A charge. A sentence. But behind those lines lived a woman shaped by prolonged suffering who decided that endurance had limits. Her story does not end with the rope. It continues in the recognition that slavery was never uncontested. It continues in the understanding that resistance sometimes grows quietly in the most confined spaces. And it continues in the awareness that systems built on domination always contain the seeds of their own instability. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect on what you have heard so far. If you are watching Shadows of Black History for the first time, stay with this story until the end. Stories like this are rarely told in full detail, yet they reveal truths that shape our understanding of resistance. If you value uncovering history that has been buried in court ledgers and forgotten archives, remain with us as we move deeper into Nelly's world and the consequences of her final decision. By the time Virginia became one of the central battlegrounds of the Civil War in the early 1860s, the social order that once seemed permanent had begun to fracture. Armies marched across counties not far from where Nelly had lived and died. Plantations that once operated with rigid control now faced uncertainty. Enslaved people heard rumors carried by soldiers, travelers, and whispers in the night. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was approaching with the sound of boots and cannon fire. The war did not begin because of one poisoning case in a rural county. Yet stories like Nelly's formed part of the larger moral crisis that surrounded slavery. Each act of resistance, whether open revolt or silent retaliation, chipped away at the illusion that slavery was stable. The system required constant force to maintain obedience. It required courts, militias, and public executions. That dependence on force revealed its weakness. When emancipation arrived in 1865, the legal framework that condemned Nelly no longer existed. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in law. But the past did not vanish with a signature. Families who had been separated for decades searched for lost relatives. Communities rebuilt under new challenges. Violence from white supremacist groups attempted to reassert dominance. Reconstruction offered promise, yet backlash followed swiftly. In this changing landscape, the memory of resistance during slavery carried renewed meaning. Formerly enslaved people spoke of those who had dared to defy authority. Some names were remembered clearly. Others faded into fragments. Nelly's name survived only in courthouse ink, yet her act echoed in the broader narrative of defiance. She had not waited for an army to free her. She had acted within the limited power available to her. Historians examining the Reconstruction era often focus on political shifts, voting rights, and constitutional amendments. Yet beneath those developments lay personal histories shaped by bondage. Women who had endured domestic abuse during slavery now sought safety and stability for their families. Churches and community networks became spaces where trauma was processed collectively. In such spaces, stories of endurance and retaliation were shared quietly. They served as reminders that submission had never been absolute. The method Nelly used, poison, reveals much about the gendered nature of resistance. Enslaved men often labored in fields under direct surveillance, making organized revolt difficult but visible. Enslaved women working inside homes navigated different vulnerabilities. Their labor placed them close to enslavers. That proximity created both danger and opportunity. Poison required knowledge, patience, and access. It was not a weapon of strength. It was a weapon of calculation. Slaveholding society understood this risk, even if it did not admit it openly. After cases like Nelly's, increased monitoring of domestic workers became common. Some households altered routines. Meals were supervised more carefully. Storage of chemicals was restricted. These measures reveal how deeply such acts unsettled the illusion of trust within plantation homes. The broader lesson of her story extends beyond a single county in Virginia. It forces us to confront how oppression shapes the form of resistance. When public protest is impossible, defiance moves underground. When open speech is punished, action becomes silent. Nelly did not have access to courts that would defend her against abuse. She did not have a platform to expose her suffering. The law recognized her only as property. Within that confined reality, she chose retaliation. Her execution was meant to erase her influence. Public punishment aimed to terrify others into obedience. Yet history shows that terror does not eliminate memory. It buries it temporarily. Decades later, researchers turning the pages of fragile court ledgers encounter her name and pause. They see the phrase prolonged abuse. They recognize the pattern across similar cases. Through that recognition, her story breathes again. Virginia's landscape today bears little visible trace of that particular plantation kitchen. Fields have changed. Houses have been rebuilt or removed. But archives remain. Ink remains. And the questions her life raises remain. How many acts of quiet resistance went unrecorded? How many women reached their breaking point without leaving even a single line in a ledger? As the nation rebuilt after the Civil War, it did not fully confront the psychological damage inflicted by slavery. Segregation laws replaced chains with legal barriers. Economic inequality persisted. Yet within black communities, memory of endurance became part of cultural identity. Resistance was not new. It had deep roots stretching back through generations. Nelly's act stands within that lineage. Her story also reminds us that justice under slavery was never impartial. Courts prioritized property rights over human suffering. Abuse was rarely investigated when the victim was enslaved. Confessions were extracted under conditions we can only imagine. The record may state that she admitted guilt, but it does not describe the environment in which that admission occurred. Power shaped every word written in that courtroom. And yet, even through hostile documentation, truth emerges in fragments. The motive recorded in her case was not greed or accident. It was prolonged abuse. That phrase alone challenges narratives that portray slavery as paternal or benign. It confirms what enslaved voices have long testified. Bondage was violent, intimate, and relentless. Nelly's shadow stretches quietly through history. It does not dominate textbooks. It does not command monuments. But it lingers in the recognition that resistance wears many forms. Some forms are loud and organized. Others are solitary and silent. Each reflects a refusal to accept dehumanization without response. As we move toward the final chapters of her story, hold on to that understanding. Slavery was never a one-sided arrangement of power. Beneath the surface of enforced obedience lay thought, strategy, and the constant possibility of retaliation. Even in a plantation kitchen in Virginia in the year 1857, the system trembled more than it wished to admit. After emancipation in the year 1865, the legal world that had condemned Nelly ceased to exist, yet the memory of what that world had done did not disappear. The 13th Amendment ended slavery on paper, but the emotional scars left by generations of bondage remained embedded in families and communities. For formerly enslaved people across Virginia, freedom brought both relief and uncertainty. Land ownership was rare. Economic independence was fragile. Violence from former slaveholders and armed vigilante groups created constant tension. In this shifting environment, stories from the era of slavery carried new significance. They were not merely accounts of suffering. They became evidence of endurance. Within black communities, elders told younger generations about the many ways enslaved people resisted. Some had fled north. Some had hidden literacy in secret. Some had organized revolts. And some, like Nelly, had chosen retaliation in the only way available to them. The official record of her case remained brief. It did not describe her childhood. It did not detail the nature of her abuse. It did not explore the emotional weight of her decision. But historians studying Virginia archives began to notice recurring themes. When enslaved women were tried for poisoning in the 1840s and 1850s, the court documents often included references to mistreatment. These references were rarely investigated further. The court's purpose was not to examine the enslaver's behavior. It was to protect the structure of slavery itself. By the late 19th century, as Reconstruction faded and segregation laws hardened, the memory of slavery risked being rewritten. Some white historians portrayed the institution as orderly and even benevolent. They described plantation life as structured and stable. But cases like Nelly's contradict that narrative. The very existence of repeated poisoning trials suggests a pattern of desperation beneath the surface of obedience. Poison as a form of resistance carries symbolic meaning. It is quiet. It requires patience. It unfolds within intimate spaces. Unlike open rebellion, it does not gather crowds or raise banners. It operates in secrecy. That secrecy reflects the limitations imposed on enslaved women. They were denied public voice. They were confined to domestic labor. Their bodies were controlled. Within those constraints, poison became one of the few tools that did not require physical strength or collective organization. For slaveholders, this form of resistance produced anxiety that could not easily be controlled. You could chain a man in the field. You could patrol roads to prevent escape. But you could not entirely remove dependence on the hands that cooked your food. That dependence revealed a hidden instability within plantation households. It exposed the illusion that dominance meant safety. As generations passed, the names of many enslaved women faded from public memory. Monuments celebrated generals and politicians. Few markers acknowledged those who resisted within kitchens and cabins. Yet in dusty archives, their names remain inked in fading script. Nelly's name sits among them, accompanied by the words intentional and prolonged abuse. Those words form a bridge between the past and the present. Modern scholars who revisit these records do so with careful analysis. They recognize that confessions recorded in slave-era courts were often extracted under coercion. They understand that enslaved defendants lacked equal representation. They also recognize that repeated references to abuse are unlikely to be coincidence. The legal system may have sought to minimize enslaved suffering, but fragments of truth survived in the margins. In contemporary discussions about resistance during slavery, emphasis often falls on dramatic uprisings or daring escapes. Those stories deserve attention. Yet quieter forms of resistance reveal another layer of history. They demonstrate that defiance did not require numbers. It required resolve. Nelly's act was solitary, but it was deliberate. It was not the act of someone unaware of consequence. It was the act of someone who understood the cost and acted anyway. Her execution was intended as deterrence. Public punishment sought to instill fear in others who might consider similar retaliation. But deterrence assumes that fear outweighs suffering. When suffering accumulates beyond endurance, fear loses its power. That dynamic explains why poisoning cases continue to appear in court records despite harsh sentences. The broader arc of American history shows that systems built on domination generate resistance from within. Slavery produced revolts, escapes, legal battles, and acts of quiet retaliation. Each challenged the narrative of passive acceptance. Nelly's story contributes to that larger understanding. It reminds us that enslaved women were not merely victims of circumstance. They were thinkers, observers, and decision-makers navigating impossible conditions. As we move closer to the final chapter of her story, it is important to reflect on what remains after the rope falls and the court adjourns. What remains is memory. What remains is the recognition that prolonged abuse existed and that retaliation followed. What remains is the unsettling truth that even in tightly controlled environments, human agency persists. Standing today in Virginia, one might walk past old courthouse buildings without realizing the histories preserved within their walls. Pages yellow with age hold names that rarely appear in textbooks. Nelly's is one of them. Her life was recorded only at the moment the system sought to punish her. Yet through that brief record, we glimpse a larger reality. Slavery was not sustained by consent. It was sustained by force. And where force dominates, resistance, quiet or loud, inevitably follows. Chapter 6. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the official memory of slavery in Virginia shifted in troubling ways. Former slaveholding families published memoirs describing plantation life as orderly and disciplined. Local histories emphasized architecture and agriculture while avoiding the violence that sustained both. Courthouses that once condemned enslaved people continued operating under new laws, but the records of slave-era trials were rarely discussed publicly. They sat in bound volumes on shelves, silent but not erased. In those volumes, the name Nelly remains. A brief entry, a charge of poisoning, a note of intentional action, a reference to prolonged abuse, a sentence carried out. That is all the official system chose to preserve. Yet historians who examine such records understand that brevity often hides depth. Enslaved women did not live brief lives simply because court transcripts were short. Their experiences stretched across years of labor, surveillance, and vulnerability. By the early 20th century, segregation laws known as Jim Crow controlled nearly every aspect of black life in Virginia. African Americans were pushed out of political participation. Schools were separated and unequal. Economic opportunity was limited. In this environment, open discussion of resistance during slavery was often discouraged. Acknowledging that enslaved people had fought back challenged the narrative that bondage had been accepted quietly. Within black communities, however, memory survived in different forms. Oral history carried fragments of older stories. Grandparents spoke of ancestors who had run away or resisted harsh masters. Not every name survived. Not every detail remained clear. But the understanding that slavery had been contested was never entirely lost. Nelly's act, though preserved only in a court ledger, fits within that continuum of remembrance. Modern scholarship has returned to these records with renewed focus. Historians analyze patterns across counties and decades. They compare testimony. They examine how often enslaved women accused of poisoning cited mistreatment. They question the fairness of trials conducted under a system that denied defendants equal rights. Through that analysis, a clearer picture emerges. Poisoning was not random. It often followed abuse. It often involved women working in domestic spaces. This recognition forces a broader reflection on how resistance is categorized. For many years, history books emphasized large-scale revolts and dramatic escapes. Those events are significant, yet they represent only part of the story. Quiet acts of retaliation reveal how deeply resentment ran within the structure of slavery. They show that even when enslaved people appeared compliant, they were observing, remembering, and calculating. Nelly's life cannot be reconstructed in full detail. We do not know her age. We do not know whether she had children. We do not know the daily rhythm of her labor beyond the kitchen. But we know enough to understand the context in which she acted. Virginia plantations in the 1850s were sites of constant discipline. Enslaved women were vulnerable to physical punishment and sexual exploitation. Legal protection was non-existent. Complaints carried risk. Silence often felt like the only path to survival. When silence fails to protect, action becomes possible. That action may be dangerous. It may be fatal. Yet it represents a refusal to accept permanent submission. Nelly's decision to poison her enslaver was not spontaneous chaos. It was intentional, according to the court record itself. Intentional implies thought. It implies awareness of consequence. It implies resolve. The spectacle of her execution was meant to close the matter. Public punishment sought to reaffirm hierarchy. Yet each execution also acknowledged something slaveholders preferred to deny. Enslaved people could strike back. The fear generated by poisoning cases led to tighter supervision in some households, greater scrutiny of domestic workers, restrictions on access to certain substances. These responses reveal unease beneath outward confidence. As the United States entered the modern era, scholars and activists began re-evaluating the history of slavery more critically. They examined not only economic systems but personal narratives. They sought to recover names and voices hidden in archives. In doing so, they encountered cases like Nelly's. Though brief, such records disrupt simplified portrayals of plantation life. They reveal friction within domestic space. They expose the cost of prolonged abuse. Today, when we walk through historical sites in Virginia, we often see restored houses and manicured grounds. Interpretive signs may discuss crop yields or architectural styles. Increasingly, however, museums and historians acknowledge the lives of enslaved people who lived and labored there. They include accounts of resistance alongside accounts of labor. They recognize that slavery was not a static institution. It was a battleground of wills. Nelly's story stands as part of that battleground. She did not command an army. She did not lead a march. She acted within a confined environment shaped by surveillance and threat. Her weapon was not a rifle. It was arsenic kept for pests. Her rebellion unfolded across a dinner table rather than a battlefield. Yet its impact resonated deeply enough to be recorded and remembered. Her shadow challenges comfortable narratives. It reminds us that beneath polished portrayals of history lie lives marked by suffering and choice. It reminds us that systems built on domination contain cracks that appear in unexpected places. And it reminds us that even in silence, resistance can take form. As we approach the final chapter of her story, we carry forward the understanding that slavery was never uncontested. It was resisted openly and quietly, collectively and individually. Nelly's name, preserved in ink, represents one of those quiet resistances. Through that preserved record, her shadow continues to speak across time. By the time the 20th century matured and historians began to look more closely at the hidden corners of slavery's past, the brief court entry bearing Nelly's name had already survived more than half a century. The paper had aged. The ink had faded slightly. Yet the meaning of the words remained sharp. Intentional. Poisoning. Prolonged abuse. Executed. That sequence of terms tells a story far larger than the few lines allowed in the ledger. History often remembers those who stood on battlefields or addressed large crowds. It does not as easily remember those who acted alone in confined spaces. Nelly left no speeches. She left no letters. She left only the imprint of her decision in a system that sought to erase her humanity. And yet, through that system's own records, we glimpse the reality it tried to conceal. Slavery was not sustained through loyalty. It was sustained through force. Where force dominates, resistance grows. In reflecting on her life, we must confront the layered meaning of the phrase prolonged abuse. It suggests not a single violent episode, but a pattern, a repetition, a slow accumulation of suffering that eroded endurance. Enslaved women in Virginia during the 1850s lived within overlapping systems of control. They labored physically. They endured surveillance. They faced the constant possibility of sexual exploitation. They lacked legal recourse. Complaints against an enslaver could lead to harsher punishment rather than relief. Within that context, Nelly's act was not irrational chaos. It was a calculated response to an environment that offered no protection. Poisoning required planning. It required access. It required knowledge of timing. It also required acceptance that discovery would mean death. The court recorded her action as intentional. That word affirms awareness. She understood what she was doing. Slaveholders believed public execution would seal the lesson. They believed fear would prevent repetition. Yet the very existence of multiple poisoning trials in Virginia's records reveals that fear was not enough. When suffering exceeds fear, retaliation becomes thinkable. The rope could end a life, but it could not eliminate the conditions that produced defiance. As generations passed, the United States grappled with the legacy of slavery in uneven ways. Reconstruction attempted to redefine citizenship, but backlash replaced many of its gains. Segregation laws restricted opportunity. Violence suppressed political participation. Yet the memory of resistance persisted beneath these barriers. It existed in church sermons, in family stories, in the determination of communities that had endured bondage and survived. Nelly's story contributes to that memory, even if her name rarely appears in textbooks. It reminds us that enslaved women were not passive figures in history. They were active agents navigating impossible circumstances. They made decisions within confined spaces. Some chose endurance. Some chose escape. Some chose confrontation. Her choice was shaped by abuse and proximity. Modern scholars emphasize that slavery was maintained not only by physical chains but by psychological control. It sought to convince the enslaved that resistance was futile. Poisoning cases disrupt that narrative. They demonstrate that even when outward obedience appeared intact, inner defiance could be forming. The kitchen, a symbol of domestic routine, became a site of calculated rebellion. When we examine the broader landscape of Virginia in the 1850s, we see a state deeply invested in slavery. Tobacco fields relied on forced labor. Political leaders defended the institution. Courts enforced its rules. Yet beneath that structure lay thousands of lives negotiating daily survival. Some left no trace in records. Others, like Nelly, appear briefly at the moment of confrontation. Her story challenges us to think about how history is preserved. The only reason we know her name is because the system chose to prosecute her. Had she endured silently until death from natural causes, her existence might have vanished from archives entirely. In this way, resistance becomes paradoxically visible through repression. The attempt to punish created a record that outlived the institution itself. Today, as discussions about historical memory continue, cases like Nelly's demand inclusion. They complicate simplified portrayals of plantation life. They remind us that violence was not abstract. It was intimate and personal. It shaped daily interactions within households. And it provoked responses that ranged from whispered defiance to lethal retaliation. Standing in a Virginia archive today, turning fragile pages, one might pause at her name and feel the weight of that moment in 1857. A woman confined within domestic service decided that prolonged abuse would not continue unchallenged. She acted. The consequence was death. But the meaning of that act extends beyond the execution ground. Her shadow remains as testimony that slavery was never uncontested. It was resisted in grand revolts and in silent kitchens. It was challenged by collective marches and solitary decisions. Each act reveals that beneath forced submission lay thought, memory, and resolve. Nelly's story does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. It clarifies that systems built on domination generate resistance from those they seek to control. It clarifies that the quiet spaces of history hold powerful truths. And it clarifies that even a brief line in a courthouse ledger can echo across centuries when we choose to listen closely.